Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Beast 2 build log part 15. The first step in this rebuild is almost complete. All I need to do now is fill the water cooling loop. I'm going to start this video by again talking about some of the comments from the previous video. I'm then going to move on to choosing a coolant color and filling the water cooling loop. After that, I'm going to give you a good look around the system and talk about some of the things that happened after I filled the loop. Okay, one of the water cooling misconceptions that I've talked about previously has come up in the comments, so I'd just like to talk about it quickly. There's a lot of people that think that the component order in your water cooling loop is extremely important, because what these people think is that as the coolant travels around your loop, it heats up at each component substantially, so much that it starts to take from the performance of your water cooling loop and actually heat up components instead of cooling them down. Now, as long as you have a powerful enough pump for your water cooling loop, this is certainly not the case, because the coolant travels so fast around your loop that it doesn't heat up substantially at each component. It only heats up the smallest amount. So instead of heating up at each component, the coolant actually heats up gradually after many revolutions of the water cooling loop, and by that time it's been past the radiators many times and started to cool down. Component order can make a very slight difference to temperatures, but I'm talking less than a couple of degrees. What actually ends up happening is, if you go backwards and forwards from your radiators and take a component order that you think is optimum for temperatures, you end up adding a lot more tubing length in your water cooling loop. The coolant has further to travel, and that ends up causing pressure drop and impacting on your temperatures anyway. You are far better off creating the cleanest possible water cooling loop by taking the shortest route between all of your components and going around in a circle, so never cross tubing. Okay, back to the Noctua fans again. Now, I always say that I design my systems as I build them. And this is because if I find a better way of doing things as I go, even with a client build, a lot of the design obviously needs to be done beforehand with a client build. But for me, it's all about perfecting the end product. And if I need to change around a number of components during the build to get that perfect end product, I will. Now, particularly with my own builds, when I have complete freedom with the components, I will often change around a number of the components during the build. And I know for a fact that some builders just won't even show their builds until they're finished, because it means that they can change their mind about things and everybody isn't going to kick up about it and get excited about it. It also means that they can perfect their build before everybody sees it, so that if something isn't quite perfect, doesn't quite work, again, everyone isn't going to go crazy about it. For example, like people have with the Noctua fans in this build. I mean, it's not as if people have gone crazy about it. Actually, people were quite reasonable about it. I was quite impressed. But what I'm getting at is, I plan for this build to be a practical workstation where aesthetics were not a priority. But when I was building the system, I just really got carried away with the aesthetics. And because of that, this system, what I had in mind for it has really changed. So if you look at the build, the only thing that is taking from the aesthetics now that is kind of a practical component, not aesthetically pleasing, is the fans. Now, because I run a custom system building business, I have a lot of hardware in stock. Changing components is not a problem for me. I've decided that I'm going to change the fans. This doesn't mean that my opinion of Noctua fans has changed, and I'm not being influenced or anything like that, but I don't have a problem backing down. I don't have a problem with pride. There's a lot of people that have commented on the fans, and it's not actually because of that I'm changing them. It's just because of the way this build has gone. It's just part of the process. Now, as I mentioned, I was actually planning on stealthing the fans, making up a sheath to completely cover them. I will still talk about how I was going to do that, but the reason I've changed my mind about it is because I actually have a number of other reasons for changing the fans, which I'm going to talk about later in the build log. Okay, the wine glass sitting next to my reservoir has Mayhem's Pastel light red coolant in it. I'll come back to the coolant later. Now I'm going to give you a look around the build at the finished cable management. So just a quick look at the PCI Express power cables. I actually really like the way these Corsair cables look. I really don't think they look too bad at all. I mean, an experienced modder is going to see them from a mile away, but they're only temporary anyway. When I replace the AX1200i, I'm going to be completely changing it all around. And just a look at the SATA data cables. I really like the way they blend in. They are Bitphoenix Alchemy Black. You can see that they're sleeved, no heat shrink. The sleeving goes right into the connectors, and they look amazing. I got them in a really perfect, clean position, and they are definitely my favorite sleeved SATA data cables. You know, a lot of the others, the sleeving and heat shrink is just all over the place, and they fall apart straight away before you even have them properly installed. So I'm really happy with the way all of that looks. Okay, I did give you a quick look at the cable management in the previous video, but now it's time for a closer look around the back of the build at the cable management. So you can see here the 24-pin motherboard power cable, and here is all of the 6-pin PCIe power cables. At the bottom is bundled a whole bunch of Molex which powers all of the fans, of which there is currently 16. Up the top here you can see the 8-pin EPS and 4-pin ATX which go to the motherboard. I've also included another 4-pin Molex ready to power the LEDs which are going in the CPU and memory water blocks. Down the bottom here I've run all of the front panel connectors. I've connected up the 2 Molex connectors which power the pumps. The 2 3-pin sensor cables also run through here, and then they actually go right up to the top of the motherboard where I've connected them. Now I've included a number of spare Molex connectors ready for all of the LED strips that are going to go around the build, and I've also connected a few more of the fans down the bottom. Now for a look at the way I've wired up the hard drives. Now I haven't actually run any SATA power direct from the power supply. I've used Bitphoenix Alchemy Black Molex to SATA converters, and I have a Molex to quad SATA power for the 4 hard drives, and then I have a Molex to SATA power for the SSD, which is mounted to the bottom of the case with Velcro. And for the SATA data, I've also used Bitphoenix Alchemy Black, as I mentioned. So I'm actually really happy with how clean everything is. As I've mentioned, even though this is temporary, I've still managed to get everything quite clean. I put a lot of time into it, but I am going to be pulling all of this apart fairly soon to install the Corsair AX1200i, which I'm really looking forward to. A number of people have asked what the difference is with the AX1200i. There is a number of significant upgrades. I'm going to be doing a review coming up, so you can look forward to that for all of the details. Okay, something else I did which I forgot to mention, I removed the casters, the wheels, from the bottom of the case, and instead I've just installed the stock rubber case feet that came with the case. The reason I did this is because I've actually never used the casters. I've never wheeled the case around at all, and I find they just get in the way more than anything. When I have to lift the case up to move it around, I try to put it down onto something, and yeah, the wheels just always get in the way. And I think the aesthetics of the rubber case feet are a lot better. I'd prefer if the case was sitting down low, you know, almost flush with the surface. There's still plenty of room under there for airflow. There's about approximately 25 millimeters, so enough room for airflow. It looks a lot better in my opinion than the casters. Okay, I've moved the system back to my desk and I have everything set up and ready to go to fill the water cooling loop. As you can see, I have a lot of tissues around the build. Now, most people will use paper towels because they soak up a lot more liquid, and I usually do, but I didn't actually have any. These are purely a precaution. You always take every precaution that you possibly can when you're filling a water cooling loop when you're doing the leak testing, because it doesn't matter how many times you've done it, if you've double checked everything, you never know if something is going to go wrong. There might be something caught in an O-ring, a damaged O-ring somewhere, and it's really just not worth the risk. You might as well take these little precautions to eliminate all of the risk. It's more just for peace of mind than anything. Okay, there's a number of different ways of powering your pumps when leak testing. I've just used a cheap power supply and a power supply starter. As you can see, I had to use some cable extensions here. All I have hooked up to this power supply is the two pumps. The power supply in the system is not switched on. It's all hooked up ready to go, so that when I want to boot the system, once the loop is full and leak tested, all I need to do is change the pumps back over to the power supply inside of the case. Now, a power supply starter just does the exact same thing as the power button on your case. This one is a little bit more of a sophisticated one. It actually has a switch connected to it. And this is the one I recommend you get. The usual ones you see just look like this. They have the same two pins shorted that the power button on your case shorts when you press it. So if you have this plugged in, as soon as you switch on the power to your power supply, it starts supplying power. But the reason I don't recommend these is because if you're going about things this way, you're using a cheap power supply, often they don't have a switch on the back of them, which means to switch the power on and off, you need to either unplug the power supply and plug it back in, or you need to go to the wall and switch it on and off. And you do need to switch the power on and off a number of times when you are filling your water cooling loop, because you can't run air through the pump. So when the coolant gets low, you need to switch off the pumps, fill the reservoir again, switch the pumps back on. If you do run air through the pump, you can damage it and even destroy it, so you need to avoid that at all costs. You can see I have my switch rigged up so that it is right next to me, and this makes things a lot safer, quicker and easier. I can be filling the reservoir at the same time as I'm switching the pumps on and off. If something goes wrong, I have quick access to switch the pumps off. This is why I recommend going for a power supply starter with a switch. Okay, some other ways that you can power your pumps when doing the leak testing is you can use the power supply in your system, but if you do this, you need to unplug everything else except for the pumps. And I don't like doing this because once I've finished the cable management, I don't want to go around and unplug everything again. I want the system to be ready to boot once I've finished the leak testing. Also, then you run the risk of, you might end up getting coolant in your power supply. The best way to do the leak testing would be to get a little dedicated external power supply. Something like that's similar to a power brick for a laptop, but that has a Molex connector. Now, there are some out there. I'm pretty sure that Phobia makes one, and I actually might get my hands on one just so that I can show you what I'm talking about in the next build. Okay, moving on to the coolant color. On the left hand side I have Mayhem's Pastel Light Red, and on the right hand side I have Mayhem's Pastel Ice White. I've decided to do something really different with the coolant in this build, and it's because of what happened with Nighthawk. Everyone always says that they want to see something different, that they're sick of black and red because everybody does it and it's just way too common. So with Nighthawk, I did something different. I know what that build was, I don't need to say anything about that, and that build got seriously trolled because of the color. So what I've decided to do with Singularity Beast 2 is both. I'm going to give people their black and red, and I'm also going to give people their different. I actually have another reason for doing this, which I won't go into yet. Okay, I decided to skip the initial part of this process because it basically just consists of me putting syringe after syringe of coolant into the reservoir. But now I'm up to the point where the coolant has gone all the way around the loop 360 degrees, so I have full circulation. And this is really the point where you can leave the pumps running and it continues to push all of the air out and quickly moves on to just micro bubbles. That happens really quickly. Then the micro bubbles can take a lot longer to come out of the loop, up to a few hours even. Now I'm actually going to show you the entire process when I put the second coolant color into the loop, and I'm also going to show you how the drainage system works when I empty this coolant out of the loop. Now I actually found that the BitsPower Upgrade Kit 150 slowed down the process of filling the loop, and I knew this would happen because of the fact that the reservoir is no longer part of the circulation of the water cooling loop. Now, what I mean by this, you can see it in the design of the BitsPower Upgrade Kit 150. So, for those of you who don't know, the Upgrade Kit 150 is the BitsPower reservoir, the 150mm res sitting on top of the dual pump top. And then you get a bottom piece which allows you to connect the res straight to the dual pump top, or the single pump top as well. But in the bottom of that, there's only a single hole, and it's just a 1/4 of an inch hole. It allows the coolant to drop down into the dual pump top. But there's not an inlet and outlet, so as you can see from that, the res is not part of the circulation of the loop. It just acts as a filler and drops the coolant down. The coolant actually, the flow goes straight through the pump top and skips the res entirely. And because of this, it takes so much longer for the air to come out of the loop, and the micro bubbles even longer. It added about 10 minutes to the filling of the loop initially, and then it actually added a couple of hours to how much longer it took to get the micro bubbles out. So basically the reason for this is the circumference of the 1/4 inch hole is a lot smaller than the circumference of the res. So basically there's only a small hole for the air to come up through with this design, but when the res is part of the flow of the loop, you get the full circumference of the res. It's a lot more surface area for all of that air to rise up out of. But still, it is definitely worth the extra time it took to fill the loop. An extra 10 minutes to fill the loop is nothing for the awesome aesthetics of this upgrade kit, because it is just so much cleaner. It looks amazing. I'm really happy with the way it looks. So overall, really satisfied. You can see at this point in time, I have full circulation. All of the big air bubbles are out, and now it's just the micro bubbles. Now I don't put my own systems through the testing and validation that I put my client builds through. Normally, if it was a client build, I would put it through an 8-hour leak test. But my build, I just wait until the big air bubbles are out, do about, half an hour to an hour leak test, and that's it. Then I boot the system. So when I boot the system for the first time, I'll just remove all of the tissues. I will switch the pumps over to the power supply inside the build, and then I will boot the system. Okay, I'm going to have to leave this part of the build log here. Now, after I filled the water cooling loop, I actually ended up having trouble with one of the components, and I had to change it. So you can look forward to that in the next video. I'm going to be covering it in detail. I'm also going to swap out the fans in the next video. I'm going to swap out the coolant and show you the entire process of draining and refilling the water cooling loop. That sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.